Good morning. I'm Archie Baird and I'm the proprietor of this small exhibition which shows the history of golf. And in the next half hour I'm going to take you around the history and show you the development of the game. We begin at the beginning, and the beginning is not in Scotland. The Dutch played a game like golf long before we did, and there is enormous visual evidence to prove it. These are all Dutch boys, each one holding a golf club. The money they must have spent putting them up like that. As I say to the visitors, you wouldn't see many Scottish boys running about like that. The Dutch started the game about 1300 and continued it till 1700, when it totally died out because they couldn't make decent clubs. They didn't have the right kind of wood to make them. The shaft was hazel, and the head had no hardwood, so it was a lump of lead. There's a Dutch club head made in about 1560 with a bit of hazel still inside it. Now they weren't all as big as that. That's a big one, and there's small ones. But whatever size they were, it didn't really matter. They weren't trying to hit the ball 300 yards. They were scuffling it along the ice to hit. The target was always a stake. It was not a hole, because if there had been a hole, then you would have lost your ball. And the ball, of course, in those days was the feather ball. And the feather ball came from Holland, without a shadow of a doubt. And we learned how to make the feather ball from them, and it kept the game going until 1850. Now this is the most important Dutch painting which shows the connection between Scottish golf and Dutch golf. That is Haarlem Cathedral. That windmill is still standing, so we know exactly where these guys are playing on the frozen canal. And that guy are wearing kilts. And the Dutch never wore kilts. So who are they? Well, they're wool merchants, because we can grow sheep in Scotland on the hills. Holland is too flat and wet. They can't grow sheep in Holland, so our wool merchants took their wool to Holland and got a very good price for it. They've also got Scottish clubs, because we made much better clubs than they did. And the reason was that the bowmakers had just gone out of a job, because firearms had been invented, and the bowmakers were very skillful workers with wood. And there's an early Scottish club. The head was beech and the shaft was ash. And to join the two of them, you had to splice them together like that. And the grip was sheepskin. So that was a typical club in about the 1850s. And it was much better than the Dutch could produce. So the game came over here, and the game was so expensive because the feather ball was expensive. Now the feather ball was simply a top hat full of feathers stuffed into a leather skin. It took a man all day to make 2 golf balls. So the ball was very expensive. So when the game came to Scotland, it was only the well-to-do people who could play. And the poor people carried the clubs. They were the caddies. But the game went on from 1450 to 1850, and by 1850 there's still only 15 golf courses in the world, and they're all here on the east coast of Scotland. What happened in 1850? Made a ball out of gutta percha. This is a tropical gum like rubber. When it's warm you can mold it, when it's cold it goes hard. Dentists still use it as temporary fillings for your teeth. So it's very easy to work. So all you did was get a chunk of gutta percha, put it in warm water, roll it in your hands, and you had a golf ball. And then you could paint it if you like. Well, then they found the gutter ball would fly better if it had a few hacks on it. So then they began to mark it with a knife or a hammer, and then they realized it was easier to put the marking in the mold. This is a dimpled ball with a rim that lies between the 2 bits of mold. It's easily taken off, and the ball is revealed in its proper shape. I'm showing you the difference between the featherball club and the gutterball club. The gutterball was heavier and bigger splice, and a lot of lead in the back and brass on the bottom to save the club from being injured. And as you can see, it's really more like a modern rescue club. So the clubs became more sophisticated, better made. This was a club made by my wife's, her great uncle, young Willie Park. And he put the brass plate on the back, because when they played at Musselburgh, the first two holes go right alongside the main road, and your ball might go on the main road. And that's old Musselburgh, that's the race course. And this is a huge bunker that was known as Pandy, which was short for pandemonium.
I could imagine.
So the game really developed with the gutter ball. How many golf courses did we have in 1850?
15.
Right. By 1900 there were 2,300 golf courses all over the world, and that's what did it. Cheap and durable instead of expensive and fragile. So everybody began to play. People began to carry their own clubs. So the bag was invented, and the early bags were like bowmen's quivers. Clubs in the gutter ball period got more sophisticated, but there was never any marks on them. They were always smooth face. And if you find an iron that has a smooth face, you know it was made before 1900. Then we come to the rubber core ball, which was a bouncy ball, and therefore they began to put markings on the face of clubs. Now some of the markings were fairly simple and a few lines. We gradually got more sophisticated and deeper. This kind of club, which is called the brick road. Another severe marking that was invented was called the waterfall, but they were immediately made illegal, and so they had to go back to just ordinary lines or dots. The other thing was that they began to make the sand irons bigger and bigger, in the mistaken belief that the bigger your sand iron, the more likely you were to get out of the bunker. But it didn't work because it had a very sharp edge on it. But Gene Saracen solved the problem, and he put the flange on the club, which made all the difference, to get bounce off the sand or off the soil under the golf ball. Going back to the featherball day, the heads were beech and the shafts were ash. But people gradually found woods that were even better. They found there was a wonderful American wood called hickory, and the shafts were all made from hickory for many years, until the golf had expanded to such an extent that the hickory became very poor quality. And instead of beech, they began to use persimmon. Persimmon is very hard wood. So hard you can bore a hole and stick the shaft straight into it. You can't do that with beech. So we get what we call socket-headed clubs. This is persimmon in its raw state, not polished, or no lead added, no brass. It's just in its natural state and hadn't been polished. That's polished, and that's got a shaft into it. The irons became more sophisticated. The ordinary metal, they began to be stainless. The shafts were made finer and finer, and finally they ran out of hickory and they ran out of persimmon. So they had to get metal. And there's an aluminium driver made in the United States in about 1935 with a steel shaft. And this is a British club. We weren't so good at metals as the Americans. They made a steel head, but to get the swing weight right, they had to leave the sole off. But I've played with that club, a perfectly good wee club. People, first of all, when they went from hickory to steel, they were ashamed to be seen playing steel shafts, so they painted the shafts like...
I see.
These are all clubs made by Gullen club makers, and we had a lot of club makers in the village. And one of them eventually won the Open Championship, and his name was Jack White. And he worked in this room. This was his club making shop. And he came in at the very end of the hickory period, when the hickory was getting poorer and poorer quality. So he went down to the Northumberland, and there's a fishing rod manufacturer there, and he got some split cane from the fishing rod manufacturer and made shafts out of that for a while before metal took over. This is a picture of Jack White and James Baird outside Muirfield in 1948. James Baird is on the left and Jack White's on the right. Yeah, these are unusual clubs, and this one was made to try and play the ball out of water. It didn't work, so they're very rare. This club was to play left-handed or right-handed. This was an American invention. They thought that because their woods went further than their irons, if they put a bit of wood on their irons, that would go further. It didn't work.
Really?
These are all various experimental ones, and there's a nice little adjustable club. Now you want to drive or putt? It's straight. You want a wee bit of loft on it, a bit more loft, sand iron, turn it around and play it left-handed.
It just was, oh, you pressed this?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Oh, I see, how clever.
Isn't it? 1890, 120 years old. I want to tell you why St Andrews became important, and it was because the golfers in Edinburgh played at Musselburgh and at Leith, but these golf courses, well, Leith became obsolete and Musselburgh became overcrowded, and so the well-to-do golfers of Edinburgh moved out to the west of the city and divided into different clubs, whereas in St Andrews they always stayed in the same place, and they began to take charge of the rules and the administration of golf, and they became the most important part of the administration. Now that concludes the history of the development of golf clubs, but now I would like to show you some of the early courses where the game developed. And this is North Berwick in about 1890, and that's the Lord Balfour, the Prime Minister at the time, and some of the notable East Lothian golfers. This is a watercolour by John Smart of North Berwick, done in 1889. This is what they call a photogravure, and it's St Andrews, and it contains all the great golfers of the day. J.H. Taylor playing over the Burn, and he won the Open 5 times. Ben Sayers, who was the North Berwick club maker. Tom Morris, St Andrews club maker and professional. Old Willie Park and young Willie Park, and their caddy, who was known as Fiery. British Ladies Open, Gullen, 1897, and you can understand the problems they would have on a windy day, keeping their hats on and their skirts from blowing up. But they had hat pins for their hats, and they had elastic bands to put down around their ankles to keep their skirts down. This is Gullen, first hole looking back towards the village, and the building in the distance is the building we're in now. And this is Muirfield Clubhouse in 1896, and that's J.H. Taylor driving off, and he won the Open 5 times. This is a picture, imaginary picture, celebrating the opening of Muirfield, and that's made of Queen of Scots, and she played golf the other side of the bay in 1680. She played 6 days after her husband Darnley had been murdered, and the following Sunday John Knox denounced her in St Giles Cathedral. He said he did not think 6 days was a respectable interval. He thought it should have been at least a week. That's one of my stories. Next thing is you put your name in the book, please. And
what's the date?
28th.
28th.
So how did all this begin? Well, I was very lucky I married the right woman. I married the great-granddaughter of this gentleman here. Now, he was Willie Park Senior, and he won the first Open Championship at Prestwick in 1860, and won 2 or 3 more after that. And he was a club maker, and We lived in the middle of Edinburgh in a basement flat which had been used as an air raid shelter during the war, and it was very scruffy, but we could afford to go to the lane sales and the junk shops to buy our furniture. And one day I found an old golf bag with these long-nosed golf clubs sticking out of the top, and nobody wanted them, so I rubbed the dust off them, and the name that appeared was W. Park. I said to Sheila, these were made by your great-grandfather, nobody wants them. So I began to collect them, and I began to buy early golf books to find out who all these club makers were. And eventually I had so many clubs and so many books, I got fed up with them, and my wife gave me a little golf painting, and that is still my obsession. I'm always on the lookout for early golf paintings. So when I sold my veterinary practice in Edinburgh and moved down to Aberlady, the Gullen Golf Club allowed me to rent this room and set up a little exhibition showing the history of golf. So that's the exhibition, and I hope you'll come and give me a ring and make an appointment, and I'll show you over the history of golf.
Hello, this film you've been watching was made some years ago, and during that time, sad to say, Archie passed away. In 2018, before Archie died, he and his wife Sheila came to the relaunch of the Heritage of Golf Museum, and Sheila cut a ribbon to signify the start of a new era.
We are David and Gillian Kirkwood, the owners of the museum. We live in Gullen and we're great friends of Archie. The invitation Archie made to come and look around the museum still stands. Our phone number is 01620 842744, or you can find us on our website heritageofgolf.com. Please phone or email us to make an appointment, and we would be delighted to see you.